It was a sultry summer Sunday morning. I was sitting there in the pew at Emmanuel Lutheran, lamenting the fact that Karen Johnson hadn't shown up for church. Pastor Matson was droning on, providing background noise for another musing of teenage angst. And I remember thinking to myself, can't somebody tell this story in a way that my generation can make sense out of it? It makes a difference. Well, as I look back over time, I realized that that was probably the first really concrete stirrings of what many would call a call. It would be years before I would actually answer what I perceived that call to be, and that was if I was called to tell the story, I needed to be a pastor. And so off to college and seminary I went. And I was stirred further by the likes of Dr. Ed Fried, Carrie Moore, Tom Ridenour, Gerhard Krodel. They taught me to love that story. But there was so much more to seminary. Things I had to learn about being a pastor. And then off to actually do that ministry. And I realized after 42 years, I was at best a mediocre pastor. But I turned into quite a storyteller along the way. I wonder if I missed my call. That's easy to do. We think we understand what God is calling us to do. And we've been taught by the church that, if you start feeling those strange stirrings of God calling you to something, you've got to be a pastor to fulfill that call or take a role in the church. But oftentimes, God's just calling you to be who you are and to use your gifts and your talents to care for those around you, to make a difference in the world, in your place. Think about the first call that Jesus makes to the disciples there, but on the shores of Lake Galilee. They're fishermen. And what's he call them to do? To continue to be fishermen. To use their gifts and their talents to continue to do the work of the kingdom. Instead of fishing for fish, their new call will be to use all those talents to fish for people. Now, this is where the church gets really wonky with this whole call story. Because we assume that to catch people means you go out and you evangelize them and drag them kicking and screaming into the church. Because after all, we need more butts in the pew than bucks in the plate if we're going to keep this endeavor afloat. Well, what if Jesus is just asking them to be fishermen? And God will use their gifts and their talents to affect the lives of those around them. He teaches them the story that they may share that story in their daily lives. It reminds me of Luther's understanding of vocation. Luther was struggling against the idea of medieval Christianity that you work your way up the ladder of holiness, and so that the priest and those of religious orders were somehow elevated over and above the ordinary people. And what Luther emphasizes is that God uses all of us in our daily lives. In the midst of what we do, our work, our play, our caring for family, all of that is the work of God. And God will use us and those talents and those gifts that we employ day in and day out to make a difference in the world. We're living in some crazy times right now. And there's a great call among some that we need to do something, to say something. And the emphasis is on something extraordinary, something different, powerful. And there are those who are in positions of power to make those things happen. I'm not one of them. But I can continue to tell the story because, after all, that's who I am. And it is in that story that we have hope, even in the midst of the craziness. It is in that story that we are reminded of a God who does not let his people go, but continues to chase after them, bringing them back home, bringing them back to reality and the work of the kingdom. And so, as I look toward retirement, my project is to answer that call. It's been too long in coming. It's time to tell the story in a way that we can understand it. Your call is probably very different than mine. But God will use you this week to make a difference. You may not realize it, but you will touch somebody's life this week in a way that no one else can, because you will share who you are, and that will make a difference. Amen.